The wind carried death across the Afghan valley, and Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez could taste it in the dry air. Metallic, sharp, inevitable. 3 miles separated her from the compound where Colonel Marcus Brennan paced behind reinforced concrete, his radio crackling with desperate updates from the pinned-down patrol below. The distance wasn't just measured in yards, it was measured in impossibility. "Negative on the shot, Sergeant," Brennan's voice cut through her headset, static-laced and final. 3 miles is fantasy land. Pack it up and wait for air support." Elena's finger traced the custom modifications on her Barrett M82A1, each groove and adjustment a testament to countless hours perfecting what others called impossible. The rifle's bipod legs dug into the rocky outcrop like the talons of a predator, steady despite the crosswind that would have sent lesser marksmen packing. Below, in the valley, muzzle flashes sparked like deadly fireflies around the stranded Humvee where Corporal James Spider Martinez and Private First Class Sarah Chen waited for salvation that might never come. "Sir, with respect," Elena's voice remained steady, professional, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "The atmospheric conditions are optimal, minimal mirage, consistent wind patterns, and I have a clear line of sight." The silence that followed felt heavier than the 70-pound rifle in her arms. Through her scope, she could see the insurgents closing in, black shadows moving with predatory patience across the valley floor. Spider's voice crackled through the radio, breathless and strained. "Contact! Contact! They're flanking from the east. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they overrun our position." Colonel Brennan's response was immediate and harsh. "Vasquez, I said negatively. That's an order. No sniper in military history has made a confirmed kill at that distance under combat conditions. You'll waste precious ammunition and possibly give away our position." Elena closed her eyes for a heartbeat, feeling the weight of every lesson her father had taught her during those silent dawn hunts in the New Mexico mountains. Miguel Vasquez had been a man of few words but infinite patience, showing his daughter how to read the language of wind and distance, how to become one with the rifle until metal and flesh shared the same heartbeat. "Sometimes, mija," he'd whispered during one of those morning sessions, his weathered hands guiding hers on the trigger, "you have to take the shot nobody else believes in. That's when it matters most." The memory dissolved as Sergeant First Class David Bulldog Thompson crawled up beside her, his spotting scope already trained on the valley. Bulldog had been Elena's spotter for 18 months, long enough to read the micro-expressions that crossed her face before even the most difficult shots. He'd seen her thread bullets through windows barely wider than the projectile itself, watched her account for variables that made other snipers shake their heads in disbelief. "I've got the range," Bulldog whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. 15,848 yards. Wind is consistent at 12 knots from the northwest, but there's a thermal layer about halfway that's going to push you around to the east. Elena nodded, her eyes finding the scope's familiar embrace. The world narrowed to a circle of magnified reality where every blade of grass, every shifting shadow took on profound significance. She could see the lead insurgent now, a tall figure in desert camouflage who moved with the confidence of someone who believed himself beyond reach. He was directing the others, pointing toward the disabled Humvee with casual authority. "Bulldog," she murmured, "what's the bullet drop at this distance?" "Is approximately 450 inches, accounting for altitude and atmospheric pressure. But, Elena, even with perfect conditions, the margin of error is acceptable," she finished. Through the scope, she watched the insurgent leader raise what appeared to be an RPG to his shoulder. In 30 seconds, maybe less, Spider and Chen would be nothing more than scattered metal and memories. Colonel Brennan's voice exploded through the radio. Vasquez, I'm ordering you to stand down immediately. We have fast movers inbound in 15 minutes. Sir, Elena replied, her voice carrying a calm that surprised even her. With respect, those soldiers don't have 15 minutes. She began the breathing pattern her father had taught her. In through the nose for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth for 4. The world slowed, became crystalline. Her heartbeat, which had been thundering moments before, settled into the steady rhythm of absolute focus. She could feel Bulldog beside her, his presence both comforting and electric with tension. The insurgent with the RPG was taking aim. Through her scope, Elena could see his finger on the trigger and could almost read the lethal intent in his posture. Time compressed into a single, sharp-edged moment where everything, her father's lessons, her own relentless training, the lives of 2 soldiers she'd never met but would die to protect, crystallized into perfect clarity. Windhold, 2.3 mils left, Bulldog whispered. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena's finger found the trigger, that familiar curve of metal that had become as familiar as her own pulse. Barrett's weight settled into her shoulder like an extension of her own body. At 3 miles, the bullet would take nearly 9 seconds to reach its target, an eternity in combat time. Long enough for doubt to creep in, long enough for the target to move, long enough for 1,000 variables to transform accuracy into chaos. But as Elena began to apply pressure to the trigger, she felt something she'd never experienced before. Absolute certainty. Not confidence, not hope, but knowledge as pure and undeniable as gravity itself. The shot was possible. More than possible, it was inevitable. The world held its breath. Through the radio, Spider's voice cut through the static, sharp with desperation. "They've got us zeroed in. We need help now, or we're not making it home." Colonel Brennan's response was immediate and furious. "Vasquez, if you take that shot without authorization, I'll have you court-martialed. That's a direct order from your commanding officer." Elena's grip on the rifle never wavered. Through her scope, she could see the insurgent's finger tightening on the RPG trigger. The mathematics of the moment were simple and terrible. In 3 seconds, her fellow soldiers would be dead. In 4 seconds, if she fired now, her career would be over. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Copy that, sir," she said quietly, and squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared, its muzzle blast creating a shockwave that rippled through the mountain air like thunder given form. The rifle bucked against Elena's shoulder with familiar violence, and she rode the recoil like a sailor rides a wave, accepting it, channeling it, already cycling the bolt for a follow-up shot she prayed wouldn't be necessary. The bullet began its journey across the impossible distance, carrying with it not just kinetic energy, but the weight of Elena's career, the lives of 2 soldiers she'd never met but would die to protect, crystallized, impure and undeniable as gravity itself. 9 seconds stretched into eternity. Through her scope, Elena watched her bullet disappear into the heat shimmer that danced above the valley floor. For those 9 eternal seconds, she became a creature of pure mathematics, calculating wind drift, bullet drop, the slight rotation of the earth itself that could nudge her projectile mere inches off course. Beside her, Bulldog held his breath, his spotting scope tracking the invisible trajectory of their shared hope. The insurgent with the RPG never saw death coming. The .5 caliber round struck him center mass with the force of a sledgehammer, lifting him off his feet and sending the RPG spiraling harmlessly into the dust. Even at 3 miles, the impact was unmistakable, a sudden violent interruption of motion that spoke louder than any radio confirmation could. "Holy Christ," Bulldog whispered, his voice filled with something between awe and terror. "You actually did it!" The remaining insurgents scattered like startled birds, their coordinated assault dissolving into chaos as they tried to comprehend how death had reached across such an impossible distance. Through the radio, Spider's voice erupted in incredulous relief. "Contact down. The bastard with the RPG just dropped like a sack of cement. How the hell?" But Elena was already cycling her bolt, chambering a second round with mechanical precision. Through her scope, she could see another insurgent trying to rally the others, gesturing toward the Humvee with renewed aggression. The mathematics began again. Range, wind, drop, but this time with the confidence of proven possibility. Colonel Brennan's voice cut through the celebration like a blade. "Vasquez, what part of direct order don't you understand? You just committed career suicide for a lucky shot." Lucky. The word hit Elena harder than the rifle's recoil. Lucky implied accident, chance, a random confluence of variables that somehow aligned despite the impossibility. It diminished the years of training, the countless hours perfecting her craft, the mathematical precision that had just saved 2 lives. "Second target acquired," she announced calmly, her eyes never leaving the scope. The insurgent below was raising an AK-47, preparing to spray automatic fire toward the stranded Humvee. Taking the shot. "Negative! Stand down immediately, Sergeant!" Elena's finger found the trigger for the second time. The world compressed into that familiar circle of magnified reality, where moral complexity simplified into stark mathematics. Target, distance, wind, time. The insurgent's finger was tightening on his own trigger when Elena's second shot began its journey across the valley. This time, the wait felt shorter. Perhaps it was familiarity, or perhaps time itself had bent to accommodate the impossible becoming routine. The bullet found its mark with the same devastating precision, and the insurgent crumpled as though his strings had been cut by an invisible hand. The remaining fighters broke and ran. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph!" Chen's voice crackled through the radio, thick with emotion. "Whoever's up there just saved our asses with 2 shots that shouldn't exist." Bulldog was staring at Elena as though she'd turned water into wine. In 18 months of combat deployments, he'd seen her make shots that defied conventional wisdom, but never anything like this. Never anything that rewrote the fundamental understanding of what was possible with a rifle and perfect marksmanship. "Elena," he said quietly, "do you understand what you just did?" She was already breaking down her shooting position, muscle memory taking over as she prepared for the inevitable consequences of her disobedience. Barrett's components moved through her hands like prayer beads, familiar, comforting, precise. "I saved 2 soldiers," she replied simply. But even as she spoke, Elena knew that Bulldog's question carried deeper implications. In 9 seconds, she had shattered the accepted limitations of her profession. Every sniper school, every training manual, every expert who claimed that 3-mile shots were impossible would now have to reconcile their beliefs with the reality of what had just occurred. Colonel Brennan's voice returned to the radio, colder than the mountain air. "Vasquez, report to my office immediately upon return to base. And Vasquez, bring your service record. You're going to need it." As Elena secured her rifle and prepared for the long walk back to base, she found herself thinking about her father's weathered hands guiding hers on that childhood rifle. Miguel Vasquez had died 3 years ago, never knowing that his daughter would one day take a shot that would echo through military history. But somehow, Elena felt his presence in the mountain wind, felt his approval in the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. The radio crackled one final time as Spider and Chen prepared to move out of the valley. "Unknown shooter, this is Delta 7. I don't know who you are or where you are, but you just gave us our lives back. We won't forget." Elena shouldered her pack and began the descent, carrying not just her equipment, but the weight of a moment that had changed everything. Behind her, Bulldog followed in contemplative silence, occasionally shaking his head as though trying to convince himself that what he'd witnessed had actually occurred. The impossible shot had been fired. Now comes the reckoning. Elena Vasquez had learned to navigate the peculiar mathematics of military life long before she ever picked up a sniper rifle. Every morning began with the same ritual. 0430 hours, feet hitting the cold barracks floor before her conscious mind had fully awakened. The rhythm was as ingrained as breathing. Dress, run, eat, train, repeat. But beneath the surface of regimented routine lived a woman whose relationship with precision had been forged in the crucible of childhood loss and paternal guidance. She stood now in the pre-dawn darkness of forward operating base Griffin, her breath visible in the thin mountain air as she performed the ritual that had sustained her through 4 combat deployments. The Barrett M82A1 lay disassembled on the maintenance table, each component clean and oiled to perfection. Elena's hands moved through the cleaning process with meditative focus, her fingertips reading the metal surfaces for microscopic imperfections that could mean the difference between life and death at extreme ranges. "You're up early, even for you," observed to Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, Elena's closest friend and the base's communications specialist. Maria poured coffee from a thermos that had seen better days, the metal scarred by shrapnel from an IED blast 6 months prior. "Can't sleep?" Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm metal cup. "Sleep's overrated. Besides, the colonel wants to see me at 0800. "About yesterday?" Maria's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to navigate the complex politics of military hierarchy. Word of the impossible shots had spread through the base like wildfire, creating ripples of admiration, skepticism, and concern in equal measure. Among other things, Elena's fingers continued their methodical inspection of the rifle's barrel, checking for the microscopic wear patterns that could affect accuracy at extreme ranges. "You know how it is, Maria. Make a shot nobody believes in, and suddenly everyone's an expert on what's possible." The truth was more complicated than Elena cared to admit, even to herself. The shots across the valley felt different, not just in terms of distance or difficulty, but in the absolute certainty that had preceded them. She'd fired thousands of rounds in combat, made hundreds of kills that saved American lives, but never with the crystalline clarity she'd experienced yesterday. It troubled her in ways she couldn't articulate. Maria settled onto the adjacent bench, her own morning routine disrupted by concern for her friend. They'd met during advanced individual training 3 years ago, 2 women navigating a profession dominated by men who questioned their presence at every turn. Elena had earned respect through pure skill, but Maria had watched the toll that constant proving herself had taken. "You know what I think?" Maria said, her voice gentle but insistent. "I think you're scared." Scared of what?" "Of being right, about what you can do, I mean. For 3 years, I've watched you make shots that shouldn't be possible, and every time you act like it's just training and luck. But yesterday was different, wasn't it?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, impossible to ignore and equally impossible to answer honestly. Elena had been raised by a father who believed that precision was both a gift and a responsibility. Miguel Vasquez had been a hunting guide in New Mexico, a man who could read wind patterns like poetry and who'd taught his daughter that the rifle was merely an extension of will made manifest. "Mia," he told her during one of their dawn hunts, "the difference between a good shot and a great one isn't the equipment or the training. It's the willingness to accept that some things are possible even when everyone else says they're not." Elena had been 14 then, already out shooting boys twice her age at local competitions. But it wasn't until her father's funeral, killed by a drunk driver on a rain-slicked highway outside Albuquerque, that she'd understood the full weight of his words. The rifle had become her connection to his memory, each shot a conversation across the veil of mortality. "Elena," Maria's voice brought her back to the present, "you're doing that thing where you disappear inside your head." "Sorry." Elena resumed her cleaning, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had faltered. "Just thinking about my dad." Maria nodded with understanding. She'd heard the stories of Miguel Vasquez, had seen the way Elena's entire demeanor changed when she spoke about him. It was one of the few times when Elena's carefully maintained emotional armor showed cracks, revealing the grieving daughter beneath the consummate professional. The barracks door opened with a metallic screech, admitting Corporal Danny "Ghost" Reeves, the youngest member of their sniper team. Ghost carried 2 steaming plates from the mess hall, the universal peace offering of military friendship. "Figured you'd be here," Ghost said, setting the plates on the maintenance table with exaggerated care. "Made sure to get extra bacon. Today feels like a bacon kind of day." Elena smiled despite herself. Ghost had arrived at the FOB 3 months ago, fresh from sniper school and filled with the enthusiastic confidence that only came from never having killed another human being. Elena had taken him under her wing, teaching him the subtle differences between classroom theory and combat reality. Yesterday's shots had left him in a state of barely contained hero worship that made Elena profoundly uncomfortable. "Ghost," Elena said, accepting the plate gratefully, "you don't have to bring me breakfast every morning." "Yeah, I do." Ghost settled onto the floor, his long legs folding with the easy flexibility of youth. "You saved Spider and Chen yesterday with shots that the instructors at sniper school said were impossible. That makes you worth a few extra strips of bacon." Elena took a bite of the overcooked eggs, using the time to consider her response. Ghost's admiration was genuine, but dangerous. It transformed her into something she wasn't, elevated skill into mythology. In her experience, mythological soldiers got people killed. "Ghost, listen to me carefully," Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "What happened yesterday was the result of optimal conditions, extensive training, and yes, a significant amount of luck. Don't turn it into something it wasn't." "But the math works out," Ghost protested, pulling a notebook from his cargo pocket. Elena recognized it as his sniper journal, pages covered with calculations and observations from their training sessions. "I've been running the numbers all night, accounting for atmospheric pressure, wind drift, Coriolis effect, bullet drop. Even with perfect conditions, the margin of error should have made those shots impossible." Maria exchanged a glance with Elena, recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering. Ghost's mathematical mind was both his greatest strength and his potential weakness as a sniper. He approached marksmanship like an engineering problem, reducing the art of precision shooting to formulas and equations. "The math is just the foundation," Elena explained patiently. "What makes the difference is the ability to synthesize all those variables into instinctive knowledge. You can't calculate your way to a perfect shot. At some point, you have to trust your training and take the shot."
"Practice," she said finally. "Thousands of rounds, hundreds of different conditions, learning to trust your equipment and your training even when logic says it shouldn't work." But even as she spoke, Elena knew she was leaving something out. The indefinable element that separated good snipers from legendary ones. Her father had possessed it, that ability to make shots that defied explanation. Elena had inherited it, refined it, and yesterday had pushed it to its absolute limits. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant First Class Thompson, his expression grim in the morning light. Bulldog had been Elena's spotter for 18 months, long enough to read her moods and motivations with uncanny accuracy. This morning, he looked like a man carrying uncomfortable knowledge. "Elena, we need to talk," he said quietly, privately. Maria and Ghost exchanged glances, recognizing the dismissal implicit in Bulldog's tone. They gathered their breakfast plates and equipment, Maria squeezing Elena's shoulder in wordless support as they departed. When they were alone, Bulldog settled onto the bench beside Elena, his movements betraying unusual tension. In combat, he was a rock, steady, reliable, unflappable under pressure. This morning, he seemed smaller somehow, as though yesterday's impossible shots had shaken something fundamental in his worldview. "I've been thinking about what happened, about those shots, the conditions, the mathematics involved." Elena continued cleaning her rifle, recognizing Bulldog's need to work through his thoughts verbally. And I keep coming back to the same conclusion." Bulldog's voice carried the weight of reluctant certainty. "Those shots shouldn't have been possible. Not just difficult or unlikely, impossible. The margin of error at that range, even accounting for optimal conditions, should have made accuracy a random chance." Elena set down her cleaning cloth and looked directly at Bulldog for the first time since he'd arrived. "But we both saw the results." That's what scares me. Bulldog leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Elena, in 18 months of watching you work, I've seen you make shots that redefined my understanding of what's possible with the rifle. But yesterday was different. Yesterday was like watching someone who'd transcended the physical limitations of marksmanship. The observation hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was entirely comfortable exploring. Elena had felt it too, that moment of perfect clarity when the rifle had become merely a conduit for will made manifest, when the mathematics of ballistics had simplified into pure intention. Bulldog, she said carefully, are you asking me to explain something I don't fully understand myself? Maybe. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Elena recognized as his tell when grappling with concepts that challenged his methodical worldview. Or maybe I'm asking you to help me understand why I feel like everything I thought I knew about marksmanship got rewritten yesterday. Elena reassembled her rifle with practiced efficiency, each component sliding into place with the satisfying precision of perfect engineering. Barrett was more than a weapon to her. It was a partner, a confidant, an extension of capabilities that she was still discovering. You know what my father used to say about impossible shots? She asked, settling the completed rifle into its case with reverent care.
Bulldog shook his head, recognizing that Elena was about to share something significant. She rarely spoke about her father, and when she did, it was always in the context of lessons that had shaped her understanding of precision and possibility. He said that the moment you accept that something is impossible, you guarantee that it will be. But the moment you acknowledge that it might be possible, not probable, just possible, you create space for extraordinary things to happen. Elena closed the rifle case and secured the latches, each click a small punctuation mark in the morning stillness. Through the barracks windows, she could see the first rays of sunrise, painting the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and amber, beautiful and hostile in equal measure. Bulldog, I can't explain what happened yesterday with mathematics or physics or training doctrine. All I know is that when I looked through that scope, I didn't see an impossible shot. I saw two soldiers who needed help and a clear path to provide it. Bulldog nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that Elena's explanation had raised as many questions as it had answered. The colonel's not going to be satisfied with philosophy and intuition. Elena stood and shouldered her equipment, preparing for what she suspected would be a very difficult conversation with Colonel Brennan. Then I'll tell him the truth, that sometimes the impossible becomes possible when the alternative is unacceptable. As she walked toward the door, Elena caught her reflection in the window glass, a woman in desert camouflage whose eyes held depths that hadn't been there before yesterday's shots. She looked like someone who had crossed an invisible threshold and could never return to the person she'd been before. The reckoning with Colonel Brennan awaited, but Elena found herself oddly calm as she stepped into the morning light. Whatever consequences followed, she had saved 2 lives with shots that would echo through military history. Her father would have been proud. Colonel Marcus Brennan's office felt smaller than it actually was, the walls lined with commendations, unit photographs, and tactical maps that spoke of 23 years spent climbing the military hierarchy. Elena stood at attention before his desk, her service record spread open like evidence in a court-martial, while Brennan paced behind his chair with the measured steps of a predator considering its options. 3 miles, Brennan said, his voice deceptively calm. Do you understand what you've done, Sergeant? Elena kept her eyes focused on a point 6 inches above Brennan's head, the standard position of military attention. I neutralized 2 enemy combatants who were threatening American personnel, sir. You disobeyed a direct order. Brennan's fist struck the desk with enough force to make his coffee mug jump. You took shots that every expert in this field considers impossible, and you did it in direct violation of my explicit instructions.
The morning sunlight streaming through the office windows felt harsh and unforgiving, casting long shadows across the accumulated trophies of Brennan's career. Elena noticed details with the hyperacuity that came with extreme stress. The slight tremor in Brennan's left hand, the coffee stain on his otherwise pristine uniform, the photograph of his family turned face down on his desk as though their witness to this confrontation would be somehow inappropriate. "Sir, the tactical situation required immediate intervention. 2 soldiers were in imminent danger of being killed. And air support was en route." Brennan's composure cracked slightly, revealing the anger that had been building since yesterday's radio calls. "You had no authorization to engage, no confirmation of target identification, and no reasonable expectation of accuracy at that range." Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Target identification. As though she hadn't spent 18 months perfecting her ability to distinguish between combatants and civilians at distances that rendered human features invisible to the naked eye. As though the RPG in the insurgents' hands hadn't been clear enough justification for lethal force. "Sir, positive target identification was confirmed through magnified optics. The enemy combatant was armed with an RPG and in the process of engaging American forces."
Brennan stopped pacing and fixed Elena with a stare that had intimidated subordinates for over 2 decades. "Sergeant, let me explain something to you. I don't care if you saw him carrying a nuclear weapon and singing the Taliban's greatest hits. When I give you a direct order to stand down, you stand down, period." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken truths. Elena understood the colonel's position. Military discipline depended on absolute obedience to lawful orders, even when those orders seemed tactically questionable. But she also understood that Spider Martinez and Sarah Chen were alive because she had chosen disobedience over compliance. "Sir," Elena said carefully, "with respect, I believe my actions were justified by the immediate threat to friendly forces." Brennan's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Justified? Sergeant, you just created a public relations nightmare. Word of these impossible shots is already spreading through the base like wildfire. I've got officers calling me wanting to know if we've developed some kind of secret superweapon, and journalists who somehow got wind of the story asking questions I can't answer." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. She hadn't considered the broader implications of her actions, hadn't thought beyond the immediate necessity of saving lives. In the military, extraordinary achievements could be as dangerous as catastrophic failures, both requiring explanations that disrupted the comfortable predictability of institutional thinking. The office door opened without ceremony, admitting Command Sergeant Major William Iron Mike Harrison, a man whose presence seemed to compress the available oxygen in any room he entered. Harrison had been Elena's advocate since her arrival at FOB Griffin, recognizing in her the kind of rare talent that emerged maybe once in a generation. His expression this morning suggested that advocacy might be reaching its limits. "Colonel," Harrison said, his voice carrying the gravitas of 30 years in uniform, "we need to discuss the operational implications of yesterday's engagement." Colonel gestured to the chair across from his desk, a subtle acknowledgement of Harrison's seniority and experience. "Sergeant Major, I'm handling this situation." "Yes, sir, but this situation just got significantly more complicated." Harrison settled into the chair with the careful movements of a man whose body bore the accumulated damage of 3 decades in combat zones. "I just finished a secure call with the division. They want a full after-action report, ballistic analysis, and video documentation of Sergeant Vasquez's shooting position." Elena felt the walls of the small office closing in. Division attention meant scrutiny at levels where career-ending decisions were made by officers who viewed soldiers as statistics in spreadsheets rather than human beings with families and futures. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, "there's been informal discussion about whether this incident represents a breakthrough in long-range marksmanship that needs to be classified and studied." "Classified?" Elena spoke before she could stop herself, earning sharp looks from both senior NCOs. Brennan's eyes narrowed.
"Did I give you permission to speak, Sergeant?" "No, sir. My apologies." But the damage was done. Elena's outburst revealed the depth of her concern, the realization that her moment of tactical brilliance might be transformed into something far more complex and potentially destructive. Harrison leaned forward slightly, his weathered face showing concern that went beyond military protocol. "Elena, help me understand something. How did you know those shots were possible?" The question was deceptively simple, but Elena recognized the trap it contained. Any answer that suggested supernatural ability or inexplicable intuition would raise questions about
psychological fitness for duty. Any answer that claimed the shots were routine would contradict the mathematical impossibility that everyone acknowledged. Sergeant Major, optimal atmospheric conditions combined with extensive training created a window of opportunity that I assessed as tactically viable. Harrison's expression suggested he found her answer as unsatisfying as she did. "Elena, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've seen the best snipers in the world work their craft, and I've never seen anything like what happened yesterday." The admission carried weight beyond its words. Harrison had been present during some of the most legendary sniper engagements in recent military history, had witnessed marksmanship that redefined the boundaries of human capability. For him to acknowledge that Elena's shots were unprecedented was both validation and condemnation. Colonel Brennan resumed his pacing, each step a percussion beat in the growing tension. "Here's what's going to happen, Sergeant. You're going to be transferred to a specialized training unit where your capabilities can be properly studied and documented. Your deployment here is over." Elena felt the words hit her like a physical blow. FOB Griffin had come home, the closest thing to family she'd known since her father's death. Bulldog, Maria, Ghost, even the crusty mess hall sergeant who saved extra portions for the snipers, they were her people, her reason for continuing in a profession that demanded everything and offered little in return. "Sir, I request to remain with my current unit." Denied. Brennan's response was immediate and final. "Sergeant Vasquez, you've demonstrated abilities that are of significant interest to higher command levels. This transfer isn't punishment, it's recognition of your strategic value." Strategic value. The phrase made her feel like a piece of equipment rather than a human being, a tool to be studied and optimized rather than a soldier with preferences and attachments. Harrison cleared his throat, drawing attention back to himself. "Colonel, there's another factor we need to consider. The story of these shots is already spreading beyond military channels. I've heard unofficial reports that combat journalists embedded with other units are asking questions." Elena closed her eyes briefly, understanding the implications. Combat journalists were always searching for stories that captured the public imagination, tales of individual heroism that could inspire support for ongoing military operations. Her impossible shots would make compelling copy, but also invite scrutiny that could expose operational capabilities best kept classified. "Which brings us back to the fundamental problem," Brennan said, settling behind his desk with the air of a man preparing to render judgment. "Sergeant Vasquez, your actions yesterday were simultaneously heroic and insubordinate, tactically brilliant and strategically problematic." The contradiction wasn't lost on Elena. She had saved lives and potentially compromised operational security, demonstrated extraordinary capability, and violated the chain of command that made operational efforts possible. There were no easy answers, no clear precedents for how to handle soldiers whose abilities transcended accepted limitations. "Sir," Elena said quietly, "if I could do it again, I would make the same choice." The admission fell into the room like a hand grenade with the pin pulled. Colonel Brennan stopped moving entirely, his expression cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been grudging respect. "Sergeant, did you just tell me that you would deliberately disobey direct orders again?" Elena met his stare directly, abandoning the pretense of military courtesy. "Sir, If American soldiers were dying and I had the ability to save them, yes, I would take whatever shots were necessary. Harrison leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, despite the gravity of the situation. In Elena's defiant honesty, he recognized something that had become increasingly rare in modern military culture: a soldier who placed mission accomplishment above personal advancement.
Colonel Brennan, however, looked like a man who had just been handed a problem with no acceptable solution. Sergeant Major, would you please explain to Sergeant Vasquez why her attitude represents a fundamental threat to military discipline? Before Harrison could respond, the office door burst open, admitting a breathless young private whose uniform bore the patches of the communications unit. "Sir, urgent message from the division. They want to speak with you immediately regarding Operation Desert Shield." Elena's blood turned to ice water. Operation Desert Shield was the classified designation for yesterday's rescue mission, the routine patrol that had become anything but routine when her impossible shots had rewritten the tactical playbook. Brennan dismissed the private with a sharp gesture, but not before Elena caught the fear that flickered across his features. The division didn't make urgent calls about successful missions unless those successes had created problems that reached far beyond the immediate tactical situation. "Sergeant Vasquez, you're dismissed," Brennan said, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. "Report to Sergeant Major Harrison at 1400 hours for further instructions. And Sergeant, not a word about this conversation to anyone." Elena snapped to attention, rendered a crisp salute, and departed the office with her mind racing through the implications of what she'd witnessed. As the door closed behind her, she could hear the muffled beginnings of what sounded like a very difficult conversation between Brennan and Harrison. The base seemed different as Elena walked toward the sniper team's quarters, as though yesterday's shots had altered more than just the tactical situation in a distant valley. Soldiers she'd worked alongside for months now watched her with expressions that mixed admiration, curiosity, and something that looked uncomfortably like wariness. Word had spread with the efficiency that characterized all military gossip, transforming her into a figure of speculation and myth. She found Bulldog in the equipment shed, methodically cleaning optics with the focused attention that suggested he was using routine maintenance as a coping mechanism. Ghost sat nearby, his shooting journal open as he continued his obsessive analysis of yesterday's impossible mathematics. "How did it go?" Bulldog asked, without looking up from his work. "About as well as expected," Elena replied, settling onto an equipment crate with the weariness of someone who'd just been handed a problem with no acceptable solution. "I'm being transferred to a specialized unit for study and documentation." Ghost snapped up from his calculations, his young face cycling through surprise, concern, and barely contained excitement. "They're going to study how you made those shots?" "Something like that." Elena accepted the cup of coffee that Bulldog offered, grateful for the familiar ritual of caffeine and companionship. "Ghost, I need you to understand something. What happened yesterday wasn't magic or some kind of supernatural ability. It was training, conditions, and decision-making under pressure." But even as she spoke, she knew her explanation rang hollow. The certainty she'd felt in those crucial moments had been unlike anything in her previous experience, a clarity that transcended normal sensory input and tactical analysis. She couldn't explain it to herself, much less to Ghost's eager mathematical mind. "But the ballistics are irrelevant," Elena interrupted with gentle firmness. "Ghost, if you take anything from what happened yesterday, let it be this: trust your training, know your equipment, and never hesitate to take the shot that needs to be taken. Everything else is just noise."
Bulldog set down his cleaning cloth and looked directly at Elena for the first time since she'd arrived. "When do you leave?" "They haven't told me yet. Soon, I think." The silence that followed carried the weight of 18 months of shared experience,
Thousands of rounds fired in training and combat, the intimate partnership that developed between sniper and spotter when lives depended on perfect coordination. "Elena," Bulldog said quietly, "for what it's worth, you made the right call yesterday. Spider and Chen are alive because you trusted your abilities over regulations." Before Elena could respond, the shed door opened to admit Maria Santos, whose expression suggested she was carrying news that no one wanted to hear. "Elena, you need to hear this. I just intercepted a communication from the division to the public affairs office." Elena's stomach clenched with premonition. "What kind of communication?" "They're sending a media team to interview you about the extraordinary marksmanship demonstration that saved American lives. Apparently someone leaked the story to Stars and Stripes, and now they want to control the narrative." The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. Military media coverage meant sanitized heroism, carefully crafted narratives that transformed complex tactical situations into digestible patriotic content. Her impossible shots would become propaganda, her moment of tactical clarity reduced to sound bites and photo opportunities. "When?" Elena asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Tomorrow morning. Full media package. Interview, demonstration, the works." Maria's voice carried the sympathy of someone who understood how much Elena valued her privacy. "They want you to show you taking shots at the range, talking about your training, representing the excellence of American military marksmanship." Ghost looked confused by Elena's obvious distress. "Isn't that good? Recognition for what you accomplished?" Bulldog answered before Elena could speak. "Ghost, Elena didn't make those shots for recognition. She made them to save lives. Turning it into a media circus changes everything." Elena stood up abruptly, needing movement to process the cascading complications that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Yesterday, she was a competent sniper, doing her job under extraordinary circumstances. Today, she was becoming a symbol, a representation of capabilities that others wanted to study, control, and exploit. "There's more," Maria said reluctantly. "The media team is being accompanied by a technical evaluation group from the Army Marksmanship Unit. They want to document your techniques, analyze your equipment modifications, and assess whether your methods can be replicated in training programs." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Elena. This wasn't about recognition or even strategic value. This was about reverse engineering her abilities, turning her into a case study that could be mass-produced and deployed. The military had discovered something unprecedented and was moving quickly to understand and replicate it. "They want to turn me into a training manual," Elena said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "More than that," Bulldog said grimly. "They want to figure out if what you did can be taught to other snipers. And if it can't—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Elena understood the implication. If her abilities were truly unique, she would become even more valuable as a resource to be carefully managed and deployed. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant First Class Rodriguez from the motor pool, his usually jovial expression serious as he approached the group. "Elena, I hate to add to whatever's going on, but I just heard something you need to know." Elena braced herself for another complication. "What is it, Rodriguez?"
Spider and Chen are being flown back to the States tomorrow. Medical evaluation, they said, but word is they're being debriefed about yesterday's incident. Rodriguez's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering information that could be interpreted multiple ways. Elena felt the ground shifting beneath her feet again. Spider and Chen had been the only witnesses to the impossible shots from the receiving end, the only people who could testify to the tactical necessity of her actions. If they were being removed from the theater before she could speak with them, it suggested a level of control and compartmentalization that made her deeply uncomfortable. "Did they request a medical evaluation?" Bulldog asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Negative. Orders came down from division. Mandatory evaluation for soldiers who experienced extraordinary combat stress during yesterday's engagement. The ghost looked confused again. But they weren't wounded. They were just pinned down until Elena saved their lives with shots that officially didn't happen, Maria finished quietly. Or at least, shots that happened but can't be discussed outside of official channels. Elena sank back onto the equipment crate, feeling the weight of invisible forces reshaping her reality without her consent. Every action seemed to generate consequences that reached far beyond her original intentions, creating ripples that threatened to transform her from a soldier into something else entirely. "Elena," Bulldog said gently, "what are you going to tell the media team tomorrow?" It was a good question, one that Elena wasn't sure she could answer honestly without destroying everything she'd worked for. The truth was that she didn't fully understand what had happened yesterday, couldn't explain the source of her certainty or the clarity that had made impossible shots feel inevitable. "I'm going to tell them that good training, optimal conditions, and the motivation to save American lives can produce extraordinary results," she said finally. "And if they ask for a demonstration," Maria pressed, "if they want you to make similar shots under controlled conditions?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, contemplating the fundamental difference between combat necessity and performance on demand. Yesterday's shots had emerged from a perfect convergence of factors: life or death stakes, optimal atmospheric conditions, and her father's voice whispering across the years that impossible things became possible when the alternative was unacceptable. "Then I'll do my best," she said simply. "And if I can't replicate it, maybe that will convince them that what happened yesterday was extraordinary precisely because it couldn't be guaranteed or controlled." But even as she spoke, Elena suspected that the machinery now in motion would not be satisfied with explanations that emphasized uncertainty and serendipity. The military valued predictability, systems that could be understood and replicated. Her impossible shots had created a problem that demanded solution, and she was both the key to that solution and its most vulnerable component. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across FOB Griffin, Elena found herself thinking about her father's words about impossible shots and the willingness to believe in extraordinary possibilities. Miguel Vasquez had never faced media teams or technical evaluation groups, had never had to explain the inexplicable to audiences who wanted mystery reduced to manageable formulas. But he understood something fundamental about the relationship between precision and purpose, about the moments when ordinary people were called upon to accomplish extraordinary things. As Elena prepared for what might be her final night at FOB Griffin, she tried to hold on to that understanding like a lifeline in an increasingly turbulent sea. The impossible shots had been fired. Now came the even more difficult task of living with their consequences. The demonstration range at FOB Griffin had been transformed overnight into something resembling a television studio. Camera crews, lighting equipment, and audio technicians had descended like an invasion force, transforming the familiar landscape of sandbags and target boards into a stage for carefully choreographed heroism. Elena stood at the firing line, her Barrett M82A1 resting on its bipod as she surveyed the artificial environment that had been created around her. The targets downrange were positioned at incrementally increasing distances: 500 yards, 800 yards, 1,200 yards, impressive to civilian audiences, but laughably conservative compared to yesterday's 3-mile shots. Major Patricia Hawkins from the Public Affairs Office approached with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to managing military narratives for public consumption. She was accompanied by a civilian journalist whose press credentials identified him as David Chen, no relation to the Sarah Chen whose life Elena had saved yesterday, though the coincidence felt heavy with unspoken irony. "Sergeant Vasquez," Major Hawkins said with professional warmth, "thank you for participating in this demonstration. The American people deserve to see the exceptional training and dedication that our soldiers bring to defending freedom." Elena nodded politely,
though every word felt like another layer of distance between her real experience and the sanitized version being constructed for public consumption. Behind the Major, she could see the technical evaluation team setting up sophisticated monitoring equipment, high-speed cameras, ballistic computers, atmospheric measuring devices, all designed to capture and quantify what had happened in yesterday's valley. "Now, Sergeant," the journalist said, consulting his notes with the intensity of someone trying to extract maximum drama from routine military procedure, "I understand you made some extraordinary shots yesterday that saved the lives of fellow soldiers. Can you tell us about that?" Elena had rehearsed this moment, had prepared careful answers that emphasized training and favorable conditions while avoiding the mystical elements that she couldn't explain even to herself. But standing here, under the artificial lights, surrounded by equipment designed to transform her into content for mass consumption, the words felt hollow and inadequate. "Yesterday, atmospheric conditions were optimal for long-range marksmanship. My training and equipment allowed me to engage targets at extended range in support of friendly forces who were under fire." The journalist scribbled notes, clearly hoping for more dramatic details. "How extended was this range, Sergeant?" "Approximately 3 miles," Elena replied, watching as his eyebrows rose despite his apparent preparation for this information. 3 miles? He looked at his notes as though they might have been wrong. "Sergeant, military experts I've spoken with say that accurate rifle fire at that distance is essentially impossible under combat conditions." Elena felt the weight of watching eyes. Camera operators, technical specialists, her own soldiers who had gathered at the perimeter of the demonstration area. Ghost stood near the equipment shed, his shooting journal clutched against his chest like a talisman. Bulldog watched from the spotting position, his expression unreadable but his tension visible in the set of his shoulders. "Sir, what's possible depends significantly on training, equipment, and conditions," Elena said carefully. "Yesterday provided a unique convergence of factors that allowed for successful engagement." Major Hawkins stepped forward slightly, her media training evident in the way she redirected the conversation towards safer territory. "Perhaps Sergeant Vasquez could demonstrate her marksmanship skills at more typical engagement ranges." Elena nodded and settled behind her rifle, grateful for the familiar ritual of checking equipment and establishing shooting position. Through her scope, the targets downrange looked almost comically large after yesterday's engagement across an impossible distance.
"Sergeant Vasquez will now engage targets at progressive ranges," Major Hawkins announced for the cameras, "demonstrating the precision marksmanship that makes our military forces the finest in the world." The first shot was routine, 500 yards, center mass hit on a man-sized silhouette. The second was equally straightforward, 800 yards, another center hit that drew appreciative murmurs from the media personnel. But as Elena prepared for the 1,200-yard shot, she felt something wrong in the rhythm of her breathing, a discordant note in the symphony of precision that usually flowed so naturally. She was performing rather than engaging, demonstrating rather than fighting, and the difference was more profound than she had anticipated. Yesterday's shots had emerged from life-or-death necessity, from the absolute clarity that came when failure meant watching fellow soldiers die. Today's demonstration carried no such stakes, no urgency beyond the artificial pressure of cameras and evaluation equipment. Elena squeezed the trigger on the third shot and knew immediately that something was wrong. The bullet struck the target but several inches off-center, still a killing shot by any reasonable standard, but a clear indication that her usual precision had been compromised by the artificial environment. "Excellent shooting, Sergeant," Major Hawkins announced, though Elena could see concern flickering in her eyes. The technical evaluation team was clustered around their monitoring equipment, undoubtedly comparing today's performance with their mathematical models of yesterday's impossible shots. The journalist sensed an opportunity. "Sergeant,
That last shot seemed slightly off target. Is that typical of your accuracy? Elena felt heat rising in her cheeks, a combination of embarrassment and anger at being put in this position. Sir, marksmanship is affected by numerous variables. Consistency comes from controlling as many of those variables as possible. But yesterday, under combat conditions, you achieved perfect accuracy at a distance nearly 3 times greater than what we've seen here. The question hung in the air like a challenge, demanding an explanation that Elena couldn't provide without revealing her own confusion about what had happened in those crucial moments. She looked at the journalist, at the cameras recording her every expression, at the technical specialists who were trying to reverse engineer her abilities into reproducible doctrine. Sir, Elena said quietly, yesterday I was saving lives. Today, I'm putting on a show. The difference matters more than you might realize. Major Hawkins stepped forward quickly, recognizing the potential for Elena's honesty to undermine the carefully constructed narrative. What Sergeant Vasquez means is that combat conditions provide additional motivation that can enhance performance. But Elena was tired of having her words translated and sanitized, tired of watching her extraordinary moment being reduced to digestible propaganda. No, Major, that's not what I mean. The silence that followed felt electric with tension. Elena could see Bulldog tensing at his spotting position, could feel Ghost's wide-eyed attention from across the range. The cameras continued rolling, capturing a moment that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. What I mean, Elena continued, looking directly into the primary camera, is that yesterday I took shots that shouldn't have been possible because the alternative was watching fellow soldiers die. I can't replicate that certainty on command, can't manufacture that clarity for demonstration purposes. What happened yesterday was extraordinary precisely because it emerged from circumstances that can't be controlled or predicted. Major Hawkins looked like someone watching a carefully planned operation collapse in real time. The journalist scribbled frantically, recognizing that Elena's unscripted honesty was far more compelling than any prepared statement could have been.
Sergeant, he pressed, are you saying that your abilities are somehow enhanced by combat stress? Elena considered the question, searching for words that might convey the complexity of what she'd experienced without making herself sound delusional or mystical. I'm saying that some things become possible when they absolutely must be possible. Yesterday, those shots weren't just likely or probable, they were necessary, and sometimes necessity creates its own form of certainty. The technical evaluation team was clustered around their equipment, clearly struggling to reconcile Elena's philosophical explanation with their quantitative analysis. One of them, a thin man with the bearing of an academic, approached the firing line with visible frustration. Sergeant Vasquez, he said, consulting a tablet filled with mathematical calculations, our preliminary analysis suggests that yesterday's shots exceeded the physical limitations of your equipment by a significant margin. Can you explain how that's possible? Elena looked at him for a long moment, recognizing in his earnest confusion the same questions that had been plaguing her since yesterday's engagement. Sir, I can't explain it mathematically. I can only tell you that when I looked through my scope yesterday, those shots felt as certain as gravity. The admission created another wave of uncomfortable silence. Elena could see the various agendas colliding in real time, the media team's desire for inspiring content, the technical specialists' need for quantifiable explanations, the military's requirement for predictable capabilities that could be replicated and deployed. But underneath all the political and institutional pressures, Elena sensed something else, genuine curiosity about the limits of human capability, about the moments when ordinary people transcended their apparent limitations through sheer force of will and necessity. Perhaps, she said finally, that's the real lesson here. Not that impossible shots can be made on demand, but that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when the stakes are high enough and the cause is just enough. Yesterday, I didn't make those shots because I'm superhuman. I made them because 2 soldiers needed help,
and I was in a position to provide it. The journalist was writing rapidly, clearly recognizing that Elena's impromptu philosophy was more compelling than any prepared demonstration. And if you faced similar circumstances again? Elena looked across the range toward the mountains where yesterday's impossible shots had rewritten her understanding of her own capabilities. Then I'd do whatever was necessary, sir, just like any soldier would. The fallout from Elena's unscripted honesty began within hours of the media demonstration. Major Hawkins had disappeared into urgent conferences with higher command, while the technical evaluation team packed their equipment with the grim efficiency of researchers whose hypotheses had been shattered by inconvenient reality. The journalist, David Chen, lingered on base longer than his official schedule permitted, conducting informal interviews with anyone willing to discuss the enigmatic sniper who had redefined the possible. Elena found herself in an uncomfortable limbo, officially still assigned to FOB Griffin, but effectively quarantined from normal operations while various authorities debated her fate. She spent the afternoon in the equipment shed with Bulldog and Ghost, ostensibly maintaining gear, but actually trying to process the implications of her morning's confession. "You realize what you just did, don't you?" Bulldog asked, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and concern. "You basically told the entire military establishment that their understanding of marksmanship is incomplete." Elena continued cleaning her rifle with methodical precision, finding comfort in the familiar ritual. "I told them the truth. What they do with it is their decision." Ghost looked up from his journal, where he'd been frantically documenting every detail of the morning's demonstration. "But, Elena, if you can't replicate those shots on demand, doesn't that make you less valuable to them? I mean, strategically speaking?" The question cut closer to Elena's fears than Ghost probably realized. A soldier whose extraordinary abilities couldn't be reliably deployed was worse than useless. She was a liability, a wild card that disrupted careful planning and predictable outcomes.
Before Elena could formulate a response, the shed door opened to admit Sergeant Major Harrison, whose expression suggested he was carrying news that would reshape everything once again. Behind him came an unexpected figure, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell from the Army Research Laboratory, a woman whose reputation in military circles combined brilliant theoretical work with practical field experience. "Sergeant Vasquez," Harrison said formally, "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell has some questions about your unique capabilities." Elena stood and rendered appropriate military courtesy, but her attention was focused on Mitchell's intense gray eyes. The lieutenant colonel carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to solving complex problems, but Elena sensed uncertainty beneath her professional demeanor. "Sergeant," Mitchell began without preamble, "I've reviewed the technical data from yesterday's engagement and this morning's demonstration. The mathematical impossibility of your combat shots is undeniable, but so is their effectiveness. I need to understand how." Elena exchanged glances with Bulldog, recognizing that this conversation would be different from the morning's media circus. Mitchell wasn't interested in propaganda or public relations. She wanted answers to questions that touched the fundamental nature of human capability. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I can provide the kind of explanation you're looking for. What happened yesterday felt different than normal marksmanship." "Different how, specifically?" Elena struggled to find words for an experience that had transcended normal sensory input and rational calculation. "Ma'am, when I looked through my scope yesterday, the shots didn't feel impossible. They felt inevitable, like mathematics had somehow simplified into pure intention." "Intention?" Mitchell repeated thoughtfully. "Sergeant, have you ever heard of the concept of flow state in athletic performance?" Elena shook her head, though something about the phrase resonated with her understanding of what had occurred during those crucial moments. Flow state refers to moments when athletes transcend their normal limitations through perfect integration of skill, focus, and situational awareness. Ghost was scribbling frantically in his journal, clearly excited by the scientific framework being applied to Elena's experience. Bulldog remained skeptical, his expression suggesting academic theories weren't sufficient to explain what he'd witnessed through his spotting scope. "Ma'am," Elena said carefully, "are you suggesting that what happened yesterday was some kind of psychological phenomenon rather than pure marksmanship?" Mitchell's smile was complex, mixing scientific curiosity with military pragmatism. "Sergeant, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels." Elena felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that accompanied exposure to information she'd rather not possess. Classified knowledge created obligations and constraints that often outlasted the relevance of the information itself. The Army Research Laboratory has been studying exceptional human performance for over a decade. We've documented cases of soldiers, athletes, and artists achieving results that exceed normal human limitations under specific psychological and physiological conditions.
Harrison stepped forward slightly, his expression grave. "Elena, what Colonel Mitchell is telling you is that your experience yesterday wasn't entirely unique. There have been other cases, other individuals who've demonstrated capabilities that challenge our understanding of human potential." Elena felt as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet again. The impossibility of her shots had been both a burden and a source of pride. The knowledge that she'd accomplished something unprecedented, even if she couldn't explain how. Learning that others had experienced similar transcendence was simultaneously comforting and deeply unsettling. "How many others?" Elena asked. "Few enough that each case represents significant scientific interest," Mitchell replied diplomatically, "and none in the specific field of long-range marksmanship. Your achievement yesterday was genuinely unprecedented in our database." Ghost looked up from his note-taking, his young face bright with excitement. "This is incredible! Elena, you're part of some kind of scientific discovery about human potential?" But Elena found herself focusing on Mitchell's careful phrasing, the diplomatic language that suggested uncomfortable truths lurking beneath scientific curiosity. "Ma'am, what happened to the other individuals who demonstrated these exceptional capabilities?" Mitchell's pause was brief but telling. "They were studied, their techniques documented, and their abilities integrated into enhanced training programs wherever possible." And when integration wasn't possible? They were assigned to specialized units, where their unique capabilities could be properly utilized. Mitchell's voice carried the neutral tone of someone discussing resource allocation rather than human lives. Elena felt ice forming in her veins as she understood the implications. The individuals who demonstrated impossible abilities had been transformed from soldiers into resources, their extraordinary moments cataloged and their futures redirected by institutional needs rather than personal preference. "Lieutenant Colonel, am I being given a choice in this process?" The question hung in the air with dangerous clarity, forcing Mitchell to acknowledge the coercive elements that had been carefully disguised as scientific opportunity and military advancement. "Sergeant, your capabilities represent significant strategic value to national defense. The Army has invested considerable resources in your training and development. Those investments create certain obligations." Elena recognized the careful bureaucratic language, the way moral complexity was reduced to accounting principles and strategic calculations. But underneath Mitchell's careful phrasing lay a simple truth. Elena's impossible shots made her valuable enough to be worth controlling. Bulldog stepped forward. His 18 months as Elena's spotter gave him a unique insight into her capabilities and limitations. "Colonel, with respect, Sergeant Vasquez's abilities seemed to be tied to specific circumstances, life or death situations where conventional approaches had failed. Can those circumstances be replicated in laboratory conditions?" It was an astute question, one that struck at the heart of the dilemma facing everyone in the shed.
Elena's extraordinary performance had emerged from a perfect convergence of factors that included not just atmospheric conditions and technical skill, but psychological pressure and moral clarity that couldn't be manufactured on demand. Mitchell's expression suggested that Bulldog had identified the central challenge facing her research. "That's precisely what we need to determine, Sergeant Thompson. If these capabilities can be accessed reliably, they represent breakthrough technology. If they can't—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Elena understood the implication. "If they can't be reliably accessed, then I become a curiosity rather than an asset, someone to be studied but not necessarily deployed."
"I wouldn't put it quite so bluntly," Mitchell replied, though her tone suggested that Elena's assessment wasn't entirely wrong. Harrison cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the immediate practical concerns. "Elena, regardless of the long-term implications, you need to understand your current situation. The division has ordered you transferred to the Army Research Laboratory's Human Performance Division within 72 hours. Elena felt the walls of the shed closing in around her, the familiar environment of FOB Griffin suddenly feeling fragile and temporary. In 72 hours, she would leave behind the soldiers who'd become her family, the mission that had given her purpose, and the relative anonymity that had allowed her to serve without becoming a symbol. "Do I have any input into this decision?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Your input is valued and will be considered," Mitchell replied, with the diplomatic precision that confirmed Elena's suspicions about her lack of real choice in the matter. Ghost was still scribbling in his journal, but his excitement had been tempered by growing awareness of the human cost of scientific discovery. "Elena, what does this mean for the rest of us, for the sniper program here?" It was Bulldog who answered, his voice heavy with reluctant understanding. "It means they're going to try to figure out if what Elena did can be taught to other snipers, and if it can't, they're going to keep her somewhere safe where her abilities can be preserved and studied." Elena closed her eyes briefly, thinking about her father's lessons in the New Mexico mountains, about the simple joy of precise shooting divorced from institutional agendas and strategic calculations. Miguel Vasquez had taught her that the rifle was a tool for expressing will through action, not a means of becoming trapped by her own capabilities. "Lieutenant Colonel," Elena said finally, "I have one request." Mitchell nodded encouragingly, though her expression suggested that requests from subjects of scientific study carried limited weight in institutional decision-making. "I want to speak with Spider Martinez and Sarah Chen before I leave, the soldiers whose lives I saved yesterday. I want to hear their perspective on whether what I did was worth the complications it's created." Mitchell exchanged glances with Harrison, recognizing the emotional and political complexity of Elena's request. Spider and Chen had been rapidly transferred stateside, officially for medical evaluation, but actually to control their access to media and limit their ability to provide first-hand accounts of Elena's impossible shots. "Sergeant, those individuals are currently undergoing debriefing and medical evaluation. They're not available for contact." Elena felt the anger rising in her chest, hot and clean and uncomplicated by the diplomatic language that had dominated every conversation since yesterday's shots. "Ma'am, with respect, those soldiers were nearly killed yesterday. I think they have a right to know what happened to the person who saved their lives. And they will be informed through appropriate channels when their debriefing process is complete," Mitchell replied, with the patience of someone accustomed to managing difficult subjects. Elena stood abruptly, her movement sharp enough to draw concerned looks from Bulldog and Ghost. "Man, I'm beginning to understand that appropriate channels is military speak for never when it comes to information that might complicate official narratives." The observation created uncomfortable silence in the shed, forcing everyone present to confront the gap between Elena's moral clarity and the institutional machinery that was reshaping her life without her consent. Harrison stepped forward,
his weathered face showing concern for Elena's growing defiance. "Elena, I understand your frustration, but you need to be careful about how you express it. Your situation is delicate enough without adding insubordination to the mix."
Elena looked at Harrison, recognizing both his genuine concern and the constraints that limited his ability to advocate for her interests. "Sergeant Major, yesterday I disobeyed direct orders to save 2 soldiers' lives. Today I'm being told that the consequences of that decision include losing control over my own future. Can you help me understand the moral logic of that progression?" It was a brutal question, one that cut through diplomatic language and institutional justifications to expose the fundamental tension between Elena's individual agency and her strategic value to the military establishment. Mitchell intervened before Harrison could formulate a response. "Sergeant, your situation is unique, which means that standard protocols don't entirely apply. We're trying to balance multiple competing interests: your personal preferences, national security requirements, and scientific opportunity." "And which of those interests takes priority when they conflict?" Elena asked. Mitchell's pause was brief but revealing. "That depends on the specific circumstances involved." Elena nodded, as though Mitchell's evasive answer had confirmed something important. "I see. Thank you for your honesty, Colonel." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Maria Santos, whose expression suggested she was carrying news that would add another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. "Elena, you need to hear this. I just received an unofficial communication from a contact at Stars and Stripes." Elena braced herself for another complication. "What kind of communication?" "The story about your impossible shots is being picked up by major media outlets. CNN, Fox, the networks, they're all running segments about the superhuman sniper who saved American lives with shots that defied physics." Mitchell's reaction was immediate and sharp. "That's impossible. The story was cleared through official channels with specific limitations on technical details." Maria's smile was grim. "Ma'am, once a story reaches the civilian media, military control over the narrative becomes somewhat theoretical, especially when the story involves someone doing impossible things to save American soldiers." Elena felt a strange mixture of pride and dread as she contemplated her transformation from anonymous sniper to national news story. Public attention would make her situation even more complex, adding civilian pressure to the military forces already reshaping her future. "Furthermore," Maria continued, "there are preliminary inquiries from publishers, documentary filmmakers, and what appears to be a literary agent. The public is fascinated by the human interest angle, the woman who transcended physical limitations through sheer determination to save fellow soldiers." Mitchell looked like someone watching a carefully controlled experiment spiral into chaos. "This changes everything. Elena, your situation just became significantly more complicated." Elena understood the implication. Public attention would make it much more difficult for the military to quietly transfer her to a research facility, but it would also make her value as a symbol and resource exponentially greater. "Ma'am," Elena said quietly, "I didn't ask for any of this. All I wanted was to serve my country and protect fellow soldiers. Yesterday I made 2 shots that saved lives, and today my entire existence has become a strategic asset to be managed rather than a human being to be respected." The simple honesty of her statement created profound silence in the shed, forcing everyone present to confront the human cost of institutional priorities and scientific curiosity. Bulldog was the first to speak. "Elena, regardless of what happens next, I want you to know that what you did yesterday was the finest example of military marksmanship and moral courage I've ever witnessed. Don't let them take that away from you." Ghost nodded emphatically, his journal clutched against his chest. "Elena, you've shown all of us that impossible things become possible when the cause is right and the need is great enough. That's worth more than any scientific study or media attention."
Elena looked around the shed at the faces of the soldiers who'd become her family, recognizing that whatever happened in the next 72 hours would fundamentally alter these relationships. She was being transformed from colleague into symbol, from fellow soldier into strategic resource. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of everything that couldn't be expressed in words. Mitchell cleared her throat, drawing attention back to the immediate practical concerns. "Sergeant Vasquez, I need you to understand that the situation has become significantly more complex than anyone anticipated. Public attention creates pressures and opportunities that we'll need to navigate carefully." Tells the extraordinary story of Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, whose 2 perfectly placed rifle shots across an impossible 3-mile distance in Afghanistan would forever change not just her life, but the entire military's approach to human performance and individual dignity. Elena Vasquez was an exceptional sniper serving in Afghanistan, trained by her father Miguel in the mountains of New Mexico with lessons that went far beyond marksmanship technique. Her father had taught her that precision shooting was about service to others, about taking responsibility for outcomes that mattered more than personal recognition. These lessons would prove prophetic when Elena found herself facing an impossible choice on a remote Afghan hillside. When Corporal Spider Martinez and Private First Class Sarah Chen became pinned down by insurgent fire in a valley 3 miles away, Elena faced a shot that defied every known limitation of military marksmanship. The distance was mathematically impossible, well beyond the effective range of any rifle system. The atmospheric conditions were challenging, the stakes were absolute, and failure meant watching fellow soldiers die. But in that moment of perfect clarity, Elena transcended the boundaries of what was considered possible. 2 shots, fired 9 seconds apart, eliminated the insurgent threats and saved 2 American lives. The shots were so extraordinary that they initially seemed like clerical errors when reported up the chain of command. Elena's impossible shots triggered a cascade of institutional responses that threatened to transform her from a soldier into a strategic asset. The military establishment, recognizing the potential value of understanding and replicating such extraordinary performance, sought to transfer Elena to the Human Performance Division for extensive study and analysis. Colonel Sarah Mitchell and other military leaders viewed Elena's capabilities as a resource to be studied, analyzed, and potentially replicated for strategic advantage. They proposed transferring Elena to a research facility where her techniques could be examined and her abilities tested under controlled conditions. But Elena understood that accepting such a role would mean sacrificing her agency and dignity, becoming a laboratory specimen rather than a soldier serving her fellow warriors. The institution wanted to capitalize on her extraordinary performance while controlling every aspect of how those capabilities were utilized. Rather than quietly accepting institutional control over her future, Elena made a decision that would prove as consequential as her impossible shots. She chose to publicly confront the military's treatment of soldiers with exceptional capabilities, going to the media with a statement that demanded transparency and accountability. Elena's public stance forced the military to address fundamental questions about how institutions should treat individuals whose performance transcends normal limitations. Should exceptional soldiers be viewed as strategic resources to be managed and controlled, or as human beings deserving dignity and agency over their own development? This confrontation created political pressure that prevented the military from quietly transferring Elena to a research facility without addressing her concerns publicly. By forcing transparency, Elena protected not just herself, but potentially countless other soldiers who might face similar institutional pressure in the future.
Elena's resistance to institutional control led to an unprecedented compromise.
the creation of the Advanced Human Performance Development Center, where she would serve as senior instructor while maintaining her dignity and agency. This position allowed her to continue active military service while contributing to research that might enhance other soldiers' abilities, but on terms that preserved human dignity. The program Elena developed emphasized systematic preparation for exceptional performance while maintaining realistic expectations about outcomes. Students learned that transcendent achievement couldn't be guaranteed or manufactured on demand, but that thorough preparation could enable ordinary soldiers to transcend their limitations when circumstances demanded it. Over the years, Elena's program graduated hundreds of soldiers who demonstrated enhanced capabilities across multiple domains. While none perfectly replicated her impossible shots, many made extraordinary shots under combat conditions that saved American lives. More importantly, they developed confidence, resilience, and capability that served them well beyond marksmanship. Elena's influence expanded far beyond military marksmanship. Her emphasis on dignity and human development, voluntary participation in challenging training, and realistic expectations about outcomes influenced policy across multiple military branches and eventually civilian institutions. The methodologies developed through Elena's program were applied to space exploration, emergency medical response, law enforcement, and other high-stress professions. Each application reflected the same fundamental principles. Human beings are capable of extraordinary things when they're prepared systematically, treated with dignity, and given purposes worth serving. As Elena rose through the military ranks, eventually becoming a general, her work gained international recognition. Countries around the world implemented training programs based on her methodologies, always emphasizing voluntary participation and respect for individual agency. Elena's return to Afghanistan decades later, now as a general training Afghan forces in advanced marksmanship techniques, represented the full circle of her journey. She was sharing lessons learned from impossible shots with soldiers who would use those techniques to build sustainable peace in their own nation. The story reveals that Elena's most important achievement wasn't the technical feat of making impossible shots, but her successful challenge to institutional approaches that treated exceptional individuals as resources rather than human beings. Her confrontation established precedents that protected other soldiers from being quietly disappeared into classified research programs. Elena's journey demonstrates that systematic preparation, moral clarity, and willingness to attempt impossible things can enable transcendent achievement. But more importantly, it shows that maintaining dignity and agency in the face of institutional pressure can create changes that benefit countless others. Elena's journey culminates with her retirement and reflection on 3 decades of service that transformed military approaches to human performance development. The Advanced Human Performance Institute continued operating worldwide, applying methodologies that balanced institutional effectiveness with individual dignity. The documentary covering Elena's career emphasized that her impossible shots were less important than what they represented. Proof that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when prepared systematically and motivated by purposes larger than individual advancement. Elena's final wisdom, shared from her New Mexico home where her father had first taught her about precision and purpose, centered on the understanding that some shots are worth taking even when success cannot be guaranteed. Some changes are worth fighting for even when victory seems impossible. Some principles are worth defending regardless of personal cost. The story concludes with Elena understanding that while her individual service was complete, the mission she had started was eternal. Every person who chose to transcend apparent limitations in service of others, every institution that balanced effectiveness with dignity, and every impossible shot that became possible through systematic preparation combined with moral clarity represented continuation of her legacy.
Elena's journey from isolated sniper to international leader in human performance development demonstrates that individual acts of courage and principle can create institutional change that serves human welfare for generations. Her impossible shots had been fired, the institutions had been changed, and the legacy would continue in every person who chose service over convenience, dignity over compliance, and possibility over acceptance of limitation. Thank you for experiencing this powerful story of transcendence, institutional change, and human dignity. Elena Vasquez's journey from making impossible shots to transforming military culture demonstrates how individual courage can create lasting change that serves others. If you found this story compelling and want to explore more narratives about extraordinary individuals who challenge institutions while maintaining their principles, please subscribe to our channel. We regularly feature stories that examine the intersection of individual achievement and institutional responsibility, always focusing on how ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they're prepared systematically and motivated by purposes larger than themselves. Subscribe now to join our community of listeners who appreciate stories that honor both exceptional achievement and human dignity. Your subscription helps us continue sharing narratives that inspire, educate, and demonstrate the potential for positive change when individuals refuse to compromise their principles, even in the face of overwhelming institutional pressure.